Buenos días a todos. Mi nombre es Sam y junto con mi cointérprete Héctor estaremos proporcionando interpretación el día de hoy en inglés y en español. Primero que nada, queremos darles las gracias a todos aquí por su compromiso en crear un espacio bilingüe. Como sabemos, la justicia del lenguaje incluye poder hablar, entender y hacerse entender en el idioma en que vivimos. Es una pieza necesaria y crítica, pensamos, para lograr que nuestra dignidad esté frente en nuestros movimientos y que se respete nuestra autonomía como individuos, nuestra existencia, nuestro mundo, por un mundo donde quepan todos los mundos. Y crear un espacio multilingüe donde interpretamos del inglés al español y del español al inglés es trabajo de todos, no solamente los intérpretes. Así es que por favor les pedimos, si van a participar, que recuerden hablar alto, claro y sobre todo despacio. Pedimos que por favor no usen o utilicen acrónimos que no todos conozcan. Y voy a repetir esto en inglés y regreso a compartir en español sobre cómo puede usted acceder a la interpretación el día de hoy. Deme un segundo. Good morning, everyone. My name is Sam, and together with my co-interpreter Hector, we will be providing interpretation for today's Plática in English and Spanish. We want to thank everyone today for your commitment in creating a multilingual space. As we know, language justice includes being able to speak, understand, and be understood in the language in which we live. It is a necessary and critical piece to ensure that our dignity is at the forefront when building movements with each other and that our autonomy as individuals, our existence, our world is respected for a world where all worlds fit. So creating a space where we interpret from English to Spanish and Spanish to English takes all of us, not just the interpreters. So we ask that you please support by remembering to speak loudly, clearly, and most importantly, slowly if you are participating today. We ask that you not use any acronyms and not everyone is familiarized with as well. And I'm going to now give some details about how people can access the interpretation in Spanish, and I'll be right back to explain how to do it in English. Thank you. Entonces, para acceder a la interpretación, y todavía no se ha encendido la función, pero en un momento usted va a ver un globo en la parte baja de su pantalla. Va a ver allí un mensaje sobre la interpretación de idiomas. Va a hacer clic usted en ese globo y va a ver allí la lista de idiomas, inglés o español, y va a elegir su idioma, ya sea inglés o español. Si usted es bilingüe, completamente bilingüe y se siente más a gusto en escuchar ambos inglés y español, está bien no escoger un canal. Entonces, si nos acompaña a través de su celular o su tablet, puede hacer clic en los 3 puntos en la esquina derecha de la parte baja de su pantalla, donde siempre le enseña un menú. Ahí va a elegir usted interpretación de idiomas y después de seleccionar su idioma, ya sea inglés o español, va a asegurarse de hacer clic en finalizado y estaremos listos. Voy a explicar esto en inglés y estaremos listos para comenzar la plática. So to access the interpretation in English, in a moment, we're going to start the interpretation function, and you're going to see a globe at the bottom part of your screen with a message about language interpretation. You're going to go ahead and click on that globe and select the language in which you'd like to participate and listen during this session, whether that's English or Spanish. If you are bilingual, fully bilingual, and you feel most comfortable listening to both languages, feel free to not choose a channel. And if you're joining through your smartphone or your tablet, you can click on the 3 dots on the bottom right corner of your screen, select language interpretation, and then choose your language. Again, whether that's English or Spanish, make sure to always click on done and we'll be all set. Muchísimas gracias a todos. Thank you, everyone. We can now start the interpretation function.
Okay, buenos días. I hope everybody has been able to access the interpretation function. So my name is Alejandra Lenes, and I'm going to introduce the Democratizing Racial Justice Project and our Pláticas today. So as I said, my name is Alejandra Lenes, and I am the primary investigator of the Democratizing Racial Justice Project, and I'm also the chair of the Department of Race, Ethnicity, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at UTSA. So the Democratizing Racial Justice Project, which is funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, was envisioned by Dr. Jackie Cuevas in very close collaboration with Dr. Rhonda Gonzalez and myself. It is a collaborative project among UTSA Women's Studies Institute and the Department of Race, Ethnicity, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, the Esperanza Peace Justice Center, Alamo Community Colleges, the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute, the Institute of Texas Cultures, and to engage in community-based endeavors to envision and realize racial justice. Through site-based collaborations, Democratizing Racial Justice elevates co-created community knowledge for just societies, transform access to the academy for people of color and first-generation students, and propagates transformative pedagogies in ethnic studies and the humanities. Democratizing Racial Justice builds on an established network of partners, bring together activist scholars, students, and community members to formulate community-centric ethical collaborations where people of color remember histories, respond to community needs, conduct collective research, and imagine thriving futures where racial justice is possible. Democratizing Racial Justice seeks to transform the role of higher education. Ethnic studies and the humanities in particular has in combating the erasure of people of color and their histories and reimagining a society in which people of color are equally valued. I'm gonna take this opportunity today to introduce the Democratizing Racial Justice team that's been working really hard within UTSA. So Dr. Kirsten Gardner is the co-principal investigator and is also an associate professor of history. Among our staff, we have Yasmin Codina, who's a community liaison, Alison Baca, who's an administrative assistant. She does all our finances. Viviana Guillen is our event coordinator, and Justine Cantu is a multimedia designer. We have faculty fellows, Dr. Sonia Liman, who's an associate professor of Mexican American Studies within the Department of Race, Ethnicity, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and Dr. Jerry Gonzalez, who's an associate professor of history. The two postdoctoral fellows who are the ones that are going to be doing our Plática today are Dr. Carolina Arango-Vargas and Dr. José Villagrán, and our interns are Elisa Kern and Veronica Alvarado. In collaboration with the Esperanza Peace Justice Center, we work closely with Graciela Sanchez, who's the director, Rene Sáenz, and Amanda Haas. So before I pass it on to Dr. José Villagrán and Dr. Carolina Arango-Vargas, I'm going to talk a little bit of some community guidelines that help us have a very good dialogue. So the logistical agreements, of course, please mute yourself when you're not speaking. Please use hand raising icon to ask questions, and share your preferred name and pronouns. In terms of the community agreement, please speak from your own personal experiences, for example, using I statements. Listen respectfully without interrupting. Respect Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Respect all gender identities and expressions, and commit to dialogue rather than debate. So I believe that I'll pass it now to José Villagrán, who is gonna introduce an icebreaker.
Good morning, everybody. It's so good to be here in community with all of you. So glad that we have such great participation this Saturday morning. And so, yeah, we wanted to begin this event in a way that sort of gets some involvement from audience members, kind of, relaxes everybody on this Saturday morning, so that we can have as interactive, right, as a discussion as possible about my research and of course the research of Dr. Carolina Arango-Vargas, who I have the pleasure of working with. So my research is, for both of us, our research is based pretty much in our home regions, right, to a certain degree. I am from the Rio Grande Valley, South Texas. Many of you in here from Texas, some of you probably from the Valley, right, are very familiar with this region here along the border that you see on your the left side of your screen. On the right side, of course, you can see the province of Antioquia in Colombia, where Carolina is based in her research. We wanted to just do a quick icebreaker. Feel free to raise your hand or throw into the chat, but we know that, you know, both Colombia and South Texas along the US-Mexico border are regions that oftentimes are stigmatized, right, in a negative way by media and by others. But those of us from these regions know that they're very wonderful regions full of, you know, beautiful people and all sorts of fantastic histories. So we just wanted the icebreaker to be, what is the first sort of positive thing you think of, either when you think of the Valley, the Rio Grande Valley of South Texas, or when you think of Colombia? Please feel free to share. What is the first beautiful thing that comes to mind when you think about these regions? Anybody? Familia, says Enrique. My grandparents, awesome. Please specify too if you're referring to the Valley or to Colombia. Here seeing the culture and diversity of people and culture, amazing. Comunidad, beautiful. Transfronterice identity, so some of that ni de aquí ni de allá mentality. Arepas en Colombia, ay, ya está dando hambre. El ambiente, hashtag puro 956. Yes, thank you for that. Also, the hashtag reminds me of how necias we are, which is a beautiful thing in my opinion. Y la máquina María, Ed Couch Elsa, of course, the high schools, the football and the high school pride and rivalry and all of that. La música, ¿verdad? Childhood memories. No, hombre, me van a hacer llorar aquí ya empezando. Qué bonito, la verdad. Comida. Also de aquí, de allá, exactamente. Las naranjas, the oranges, the citrus, palm trees. Ajiaco, okay, I'll need somebody to explain that to me. Carolina, can you translate?
Yeah, for sure. That's a really typical soup. I guess some people would call it a stew, but it's delicious. It has chicken and corn and potatoes, so it's really yummy.
Oh, ya está dando mucha hambre ahora.
I know.
Shared stories, the mountains of Colombia. Fantastic. That soup is the best, says Laura. Thank you, Laura, for that. Yes, fantastic. So comida, los ambientes, you know, obviously people. We're getting, you know, not just music, but specific music, right? Mingo Saldiva, Rubén Vela. ¿Cómo se dice? Todo el valle se desvela con Rubén Vela, ¿no? Se puede decir quizás todo el mundo se desvela con Rubén Vela. Bueno, that's how we are in the Valley. Very proud of our music. The murals and the street art of Bogotá. Fantastic. Well, great. This is the type of positive atmosphere I think we were hoping to create with this icebreaker. Get thinking about these places, right, in particular. And so I can't even tell y'all how excited I am to continue to talk about both of these regions, right? And one of the things is that, you know, for us, even though we're presenting on our research, when we engage in these types of community spaces, we also learn so much, right? Even as we're informing others about, you know, our study, we're also learning. So thank you so much, all of you, for creating such a great atmosphere for learning and for dialogue this morning. We'll proceed now to the next slide. We'll do a quick introduction of both of us as postdoctoral fellows, beginning with Dr. Carolina Arango-Vargas. Gracias.
Buenos días a todos, todas y todes. And Good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. I just want to ask the interpreters if they can help Gloria and anyone who's not able to access the translation right now. And I see that you posted an explanation, but if you can maybe follow up with her, that would be awesome. So thank you so much. So my name is Carolina Arango-Vargas, and I'm a doctor in anthropology, and I specialize in women's and gender studies. But for this introduction, we thought that instead of just giving an account of our credentials or titles, we will just tell a little story of who we are and how did we become who we are. So I wanted to start with this picture of my maternal family, the Vargas family. Because this story is really important to not only me being here today, but choosing to study what I study. So if you can zoom in to the left picture, Vivi, the girl in the corner is my mom, Graciela or Chela. And of course, as people say, you know, everything starts with our moms. But it's really important to me because the story of my family, like many families in Latin America and in Colombia, is one that is also a story of displacement. So they were 10 children, right? And they lived in the region of Caldas. And in 1955, around this time, there was a surge of bipartisan violence. And my grandfather, who's in the center of this picture, was displaced to the city of Bogota because he was involved in liberal politics. And the moving and the displacement from this region of Armenia to Bogota sort of marks our family history in very important ways and creates this memory of displacement that I believe is very important to the person that I am today and to my family. And if you can zoom into the other side, another really important thing for who I became as an anthropologist is the fact that my family created, especially my uncles and my aunts, this family newsletter. And the name of this newsletter is El Mercurio. And it's not a newspaper that is on print or anything, it's just it's something for us. And you're gonna see that my uncles and my aunts really liked writing. And so you can see here that this is the first edition of our family newsletter. And it says Armenia Caldas, Noviembre 15 de 1955. So to this day, 66 years later, we are still making El Mercurio, and we are in the number 1548. So this interest in family history, in archives, in getting to know who we are, I think comes from there, right? Now if you can go to the next slide, Vivi. So we're gonna jump about 30 years in time. And here I am, that little baby is me. And this is my aunt Ofelia and my grandmother Graciela. And growing up in a household where women were so important and growing up with a working mom was really determinant to who I became as an anthropologist, as a feminist, and as a mother. And we grew up in a house where my mom was a working mom and she worked with my aunt making school uniforms. And so I grew up listening these stories, you know, of women and a women-centered household. And the love of, you know, these women, of my mom, my aunt, and grandmother really became fundamental to me. And if you go to the next slide, because I have only 1 minute left, sorry, next picture. So another big jump on time. When I was 18 years old, I became a mother, and this is my baby, Julian. And this, of course, became another fundamental part of my history, right? Because I experienced a lot of gender injustice and a lot of what moms go through, right? And it's been over 20 years since the time I became a mom. And of course, nobody thought that I could make it this far, but I did with the help of a lot of people. It's been over 20 years. And over those 20 years, I became an anthropologist. And part of my political consciousness came from going to a public university. And I carried those those lessons with me to this day. And these are the really important parts that I wanted to share with you that helped me become a feminist anthropologist who works on women's activism and violence. So we're gonna go to listen to José's story. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina. No, pues ya me hicieron llorar, la verdad. This is such a great and beautiful, event in this sense. And like I said, learning more and more about my colleague every day, I'm impressed and touched frequently. So again, my name is Dr. José Guadalupe Villagrán. I have to give my middle name because my mom, who you see in the picture here on the bottom right, is on the call. And of course, right, I'm her Lupito. My family calls me Lupe. For the most part, go by my middle name. This picture that you see here at the bottom is actually me at about 9 years old, working in the pepinos, or in the cucumber harvest of Wisconsin. And this is my jefita, my madrecita, la quiero mucho, ma. Yo sé que me está escuchando. Le agradezco siempre por todas sus obras. And so these pictures I chose, all three of them collectively, I think tell the story of my life and my research in many ways, right? Certainly always involved in some way, shape, or form with agriculture. And so the bottom picture signifies, right, myself as a farm worker. I come from a migrant and seasonal farm worker family, right? I was born in California, mostly raised in South Texas, but here you see, of course, me working with my mother in Wisconsin in the cucumber harvest. And what I think is really beautiful about these pictures here, if we can zoom out, is that this is me at 9 years old working in the cucumbers, right? Now, this is me up here on the top left picture in the blue button shirt, just 9 years later at 18 years old, when I went to college, and I went to college on a farm worker scholarship. By the end of my first year in college, I was already protesting for farm worker rights. And in fact, my sign that you can see here that says boycott Mount Olive, right? Mount Olive is a major pickle company. And so there was a group of workers in North Carolina that worked in the cucumber harvest, that were trying to organize for better wages, more rights. In fact, they were actually pushing for a union. That group is right here on this young man's shirt in red that says FLOC, the Farm Labor Organizing Committee. So in the span of 9 years, I went from being a powerless little kid, poor, hungry, working with my family in some rugged conditions, right? And at the very first opportunity that I could, when I gained a sense of privilege by attending the university, I was protesting for pepino workers, for cucumber pickers, right? Because I know what that struggle was like. And I immediately wanted to use my privilege for good. So the bottom picture tells the story of me as a farm worker. The top left tells the story of me as a farm worker activist and advocate. And then the top right picture is me as a researcher. In this top right photo from a few years back, I was conducting research, right, on farm workers in the Valley in South Texas. And pictured in the middle here, que en paz descanse, rest in peace, Mr. Antonio Orendain. I had just finished interviewing him. He was the founder of the Texas Farm Workers Union, a very proud union in South Texas throughout the 70s and 80s that fought for farm worker rights in South Texas. This is right after he and I had just finished an interview on his life history that I was going to use for my research. So from farm worker to farm worker activist to farm worker researcher, my heart is always with my people because you don't forget the feeling and you don't forget certainly the struggle. And it's my absolute privilege and one of the biggest points of pride in my life that I belong to this community and that I will always fight for this community. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. It's really amazing to learn about your own journey, and it's such a privilege to work with you and listening to your story and the story of your people. Thank you for that. So we're gonna do a series of questions back and forth between Jose and I, but first, both of us are gonna take a few minutes to talk about this question. What do you study and why? What are you trying to do and understand? So I think I'm first, right? Correct. So, okay. So I'm going to answer this question with a few slides. So if you want to go to the next, please, Vivi. All right. So I want to tell you a little bit about the context of my work. I work with the women's movement in Medellin and Antioquia. And I want to tell you a little bit about the context. So for those of you who may not be familiar with that, and I also want to make a small disclaimer, no account of a movement is complete. And what I'm going to present to you is the research that I did before 2015. And things change very, very quickly, as you'll know, in society and in social movements. But I'm going to share with you nonetheless. So the first thing is the context of Medellin. Of course, is a city that has a very important and interesting geography. It's basically a hole in a mountain. So what you see here in the picture to my left is the steep slopes of some of the neighborhoods of Medellin, right? And we see Soledad, one of the women I work with, pointing at those houses in the steep slopes, right? This is important because it creates a certain kind of geography in the city. Medellin was known, sadly, as a very, a complex place because of violence, because of many different things. But they've been trying for a long time to do many different social programs to improve the conditions of the city, right? So in the midst of me trying to figure my doctoral research, I came across a number of women's organizations in Colombia, and I ended up in Medellin. And if you can go to zoom out to the next picture, and I met these amazing activists in 2010 and learned that many of them come from these working class neighborhoods and popular sectors, and that they do really amazing work. So they told me a lot about their city, and that's how it all began. So if we can go to the next, please. Next slide. So because I studied the women's movement, something that is really important is that this movement began way before people usually think. So many of these women started working in the 70s, and they come from peasant movements, from students' movements. And like many organizations in Latin America, they became independent because they wanted to work on their own feminist issues, right? So they felt their needs were not recognized in those movements. Therefore, they decided to create their own separate movements. And they were inspired by the Encuentros Feministas Latinoamericanos that took place have taken place since 1982. And in the case of Colombia, the women's movement, particularly in Medellin, because it's such a vibrant but complex place, is very much connected to the violence of the armed conflict. So in the picture to my right, we see a woman from the city of Barranca in front of a big pot that represents the resistance of women who were victims of the armed conflict. So that really marks a very peculiar sort of flavor to the women's movement in Medellin, is that facing the war of or the violence of the armed conflict and resisting that and the effects of the war in the bodies of women and their communities. If we can go to the next. Vivi, next slide. Thank you. So what are the issues that they work on and that I became interested? So violence, but particularly state violence. Women in the movement understand that, from machista violence to sexual and reproductive violence to political violence, this is the state, right? Is the government that does not really pay enough attention to them. So there are, and I'm going to show you in the next slide, the organizations I work with. There are women protesting, if you can see, sorry, if you can go back, protesting against the gender effects of war and peace on their bodies, right? That's the first one. then they're also protesting, and you can see below, against the kind of gender norms that prevent women from being free, and that the state or the church is trying to, create rules for them so that they cannot decide for themselves. So they really want the state to not mess with their bodies, the government to understand that women have a choice. And they also, we go to the more to the right, sorry. Of course, feminicides, sadly, Latin America is the region with the largest number of feminicides, the killing of women for being women. And Medellin, sadly, has a very high count of feminicides and murders of trans women and trans people. And if we go to the next. So among all these, and like I said, we can go to the next slide. I became very interested in Feminismo Popular. The reason why is because Feminismo Popular, and you can go to the next, Vivi, it's a construction, a collective construction of mujeres populares, working class women who have an experience of being active in their neighborhoods and their communities, and ideas from feminism. And so the fact that they bring this trajectory as working class women and as feminists create a particular understanding of what feminism is. And so they are concerned, of course, for bodily rights, but they're also concerned about water, housing, education, and the privatization of public services. So if we can go to the next, because I know I ran out of time. So I work with these organizations, and I just wanted to show you this diagram. The R&P is the Red de Mujeres Populares is at the bottom. Then I work with this NGO organization called Vamos Mujer. They're affiliated to this organization called Ruta Pacifica, and they have links to transnational networks. So as you can see, is from the local to the global. And I know I'm running out of time, so I'm just gonna take 1 minute to show the next slide. So these are the three organizations I focus on. So Vamos Mujer, the feminist NGO, the Ruta Pacifica, which is a feminist anti-militarist organization, Amoy, which is a organization of rural women, and the next one, I'm gonna end with the next one, the Red de Mujeres Populares. So, and both Gloria and Marta are two of the central figures of this organization, and they're here today, and I'm very thankful for that. But and I'm gonna finish with that and leave the others for later. What is really interesting about the Red de Mujeres Populares is that they are a group of working class women, again, who started working in the 90s through community-based groups. And they brought to the attention of the women's movement the lack of access to water and how it affected women. And they were also saying, feminists, that we have to really pay attention to care labor. Women that do, work in the house, paid and unpaid labor, that work is important, needs to be recognized, and they need to be taken as political actors, as popular women that are defined by what they do and not just by scarcity. And they want to have a say, not just in the reproduction of the domestic sphere, but they want to have a say in how the city administers, the neighborhoods, and they demand that the state and the government of the city provides access to water, because water is a human right. So I'm going to finish here because I know I'm running a little late, and I'm going to continue talking about this in the following questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina. Mexican labor in the Valley is ideal, abundant, peaceful, obedient, and cheap. These words are from a 1927 promotional film released by a company in Chicago, recruiting white farmers in the US Midwest to buy farmlands in South Texas so that the region could become a thriving agricultural empire. On your right, you're looking at a photo I took in 2014 on the South Texas border with Mexico. State police were ordered to the area by the governor in response to the rise in Central American border crossings. For undocumented workers in the region, this quickly became a problem. Much of the Mexican labor in the Valley, as the 1927 film describes, had no choice but to be peaceful and obedient all of these years later, since any wrong move could lead to deportation much easier as the border became increasingly militarized. It remains highly militarized today. I study migrant and seasonal farm workers in South Texas and in the US Midwest. I study farm workers because I think this is an understudied group of people, and because I come from a farm worker family myself, right, as I just mentioned. Having always been immersed in farm worker life, I became curious over time why it was that we were almost all poor Mexicans in the fields here in the United States. I wanted to understand all of the structural forces that shaped my reality and the reality of millions of others like me. What I found is that after so many years, little has changed for farm workers in the US, and therefore we must understand the farm workers of today within the historical context that shapes their reality. By show of hands, if y'all don't mind, on the little feature on the bottom right there, how many of you worked as migrant farm workers or have family who once worked as migrant farm workers? I'm seeing hands come up very quickly, a lot of us in here, right? And perhaps this is what attracted you to this talk to some degree. This number is incredibly high for South Texas Mexicans because the continued migration of our people from Mexico and other parts of Latin America has always been met with a repression and exploitation that leaves us little choice but to leave and look for jobs elsewhere. Considering the Valley had little jobs to offer outside of agriculture for many generations after the Anglos established it as an agricultural colony, these workers sought and were recruited for agricultural work in other places throughout the country, especially the US Midwest. This created migrant farm worker circuits connecting South Texas to various parts of the nation. This is why I was born in California, worked in Wisconsin, and have several cousins today that live in Idaho. Sometimes we return to South Texas, sometimes we don't. Today, the vast majority of the farm worker population in South Texas remains undocumented, since agriculture is one of the few employers that actively hires undocumented workers. While other industries have emerged in the region, most still take advantage of this abundant, peaceful, obedient, and cheap Mexican labor the region has maintained now for over 100 years. And so people leave. But what do they experience when they leave? Next slide, please. Often they find housing that looks like this in labor camps in places like Michigan. These are photos, in fact, from my research taken in 2015 of a migrant camp bathroom and a migrant camp kitchen and housing quarters. These pictures demonstrate the horrible conditions our people are living in when they migrate, even to this day. With the emergence of COVID more recently, some of our migrants did not make it back home to South Texas, as they historically have. This is what I study and seek to understand. What I seek to do, however, is to find a way to address these injustices in any small or big way that I can. Knowing what I know about farm worker injustice through my study isn't enough. I have a responsibility to fight back. Through my research, I've maintained strong connections with people advocating for farm workers throughout the country. Next slide, please. This is how I'll conclude. Here is a video I recorded while volunteering for Fuerza del Valle, a South Texas worker center. I shot this video in 2016 in a case in which a group of watermelon packing shed workers were owed thousands of dollars in wages that they had not been paid, very typical in the Valley for farm workers to not get paid for their work. This video wound up circulating through social media and was covered by the local press, causing the local Department of Labor to investigate and eventually rule on the side of the workers, getting them double pay for owed wages. Can you please play the video? Yeah, I'm not sure if the audio worked very well, just because from my end, it wasn't super loud. But certainly I hope at the very least the captions were useful in this case. And a lot going on in this video, right? The employer admits on video that he just didn't pay the workers because he didn't have money. But what we see here is worker power. We see workers seeking to confront the people that are exploiting them directly. And the Valley's movement, as I'll discuss more and more today, oftentimes, has this type of work at its core, workers fighting cases of wage theft and having to use sort of direct confrontational methods in order to achieve justice. Farm workers may have a lot going against them, but there are many fighting back. And I look forward to talking to you all about that today. Thank you.
Thank you, José. So do you wanna go ahead and read this question? So we're gonna do a dialogue now, expanding on a few points, that we think are really relevant. So.
Yeah, Caro, why did you choose this place to study, and how does your identity help or hurt your ability to do research there?
So this is a really good question, and I think about it, often. And one of the things that I'm trying to understand here is how do women who face so much, oppression, how do they live with that, and how do they try to overcome it, right? And one thing about Medellin and Antioquia is that it's a complex place that has gone through a lot. And what really impressed me is how much I didn't know about women's activism. And that history goes way back to the 1920s, to unionized women that were working in the textile factories. And I didn't know this. So it's a very kind of contrasting reality where you have the very acute political violence of many armed groups and drug dealing, but you have this amazing progressive movement that is thriving. And I thought that this is a really good place to really think about how women develop, how do they come with an understanding that what they live, and what they experience in their bodies and in their territorios, it's something that is not just, and how they get together and how they organize together and do things to move past that. And I think that my identity is also really important in the sense that I'm a Colombian woman, and I do have roots in the region of Antioquia, but I have a very different experience growing up. On the one hand, as a lower middle class family, I have access to opportunities that many women I work with don't have. And so that position, I understand that gives me privilege, but also helps me understand, what's it like to not have those opportunities. But also, I think that it's really important, as I said in my introduction, to have this memory of violence. And as a Colombian woman, as a Latin America, I think that we have a very, very, peculiar relationship with violence, even if we did not experience it on our bodies, the violence of the armed conflict, because we grew up, listening about the armed conflict, and that's something to your sense of self. And so that really helps me. And also having been, a mom, makes me understand, the urgency of certain things that women go through in terms of care labor. I think that one thing that sometimes hurt my ability to do research there is, there's a lot of a stigma between the region that I'm from in Bogota and the region of Antioquia. The fact that I came to study in the United States, it's not very common. And these communities have more of a connection to European donors and European peoples and feminists. So it's been sometimes hard to position myself as somebody who really wants to work with the people and produce something with them that documents their struggles, their power, their capacity to do amazing things. So, and as a Latin American and as a Latina woman in the United States, going back and forth between these two contexts sometimes is helpful, but sometimes also becomes a difficulty. So how about you?
Thank you, Carolina. I like this conversation about privilege, and so I'll start there. And I guess I do have the question for you, if you don't mind, just really quickly. Do you think that privilege that you talk about that you have, so like somewhat of a connection, but also, there being an elevated privilege, is that something that gets said to you, like, is there like, la privilegiada kind of thing? And how do you, what are the strategies to I guess dealing with that in confronting that, specifically, when you engage with the people you work with?
I don't think it's been said to me directly, but there's, especially when I work with rural women, which is one of the groups that I've done work with, there's always like, oh, usted es de la ciudad, usted es urbana. So, you don't know. Yeah. And there's an awareness constantly of that. But I think that what I do is being very honest and say that I understand there are these differences, but I also understand that as women, we've gone through some things in common, and here is how we can talk about it. But I also haven't been, in that complexity of being a young mom and, of the struggles throughout my life. I'm also open about it with with people I work with, so that they see that I think about it. But I think it's an awareness that I feel I need to have.
Yeah, I agree with you, Carolina. So in my work, right, I mean, obviously it helps me that I'm a former farm worker. And then I'm not just a farm worker, but I'm a farm worker of the regions that I study. So I have this very, and I do take advantage of that, right? I mean, I have family that still works in this farm worker circuit, friends, for example. And so because I'm so connected to these regions, it's certainly a big advantage. But I also, right, I have a doctorate degree. There's this fancy title that I have to deal with, right, that does in many ways make me privileged. So it's not like I can't just go back into the community as if nothing has changed about me, right? I certainly have to deal with the life choices I've made to enter into these institutions of higher learning that give people a tremendous amount of privilege, right? And so I definitely also have to be forward, like you said, right? Be very forward about, my privileges. And so I like to remind workers that, yes, I mean, when I'm working with them, I may have been a farm worker, but it's been a long time since I've been in the fields. And certainly, I'm here to talk about what's new, what's different, right? From my time here, what is going on now? I really get bothered when people who have farm worker roots only want to talk about the farm worker past, but they seem to never really want to talk about the farm worker present, right? And so it's very important to honor, if you want to honor your own past as a farm worker, to be very conscious of the farm worker present. And so I try to, do a lot of work by also admitting my privileges, being very forward about this in spaces that I occupy. But yes, of course, I take advantage of my identity. Absolutely. Another thing that I would say I deal with a lot, the question of why I chose this place to study, it's an understudied place, right? A lot of farm worker studies in the United States focus on California. And listen, I was born in California. I have nothing against California. Also, 65% of farm workers or so in the US are in California. They should be studied a lot. But what about Texas, right? What about the Midwest? There's also farm workers in these regions that just don't get enough study. And because, of course, I have a closeness to both regions, I wanted to study these particular places. Another thing I was going to say that hurts me about identity and that I encountered when I did research is my gender identity. As a man, right? I have to deal with what it means when I enter, for example, into a labor camp or into the living room of women farm workers. I was once in a situation, where I was interviewing a woman farm worker, and then all of a sudden questions started coming up about, jealousy and domestic issues with her partner. And here I am, right? This big young man just kind of taking up this space. And I mean, that interview, for example, just didn't work out the way I wanted to, right? Because I had to be conscious of not getting anybody in trouble with their maridos, their partners, right? Things like this. and my own role. And so I know that my study has a limitation sometimes when it comes to gender because of my own gender identity. And it's, to me, that's very important because the experience of women farm workers is central to the farm worker experience, of course. And so these are just, again, ways in which my identity hurts and or helps my ability to do research in these areas. Thank you. I think we may be out of time. I don't know if you have follow-ups, but if not, we can get to the next one.
I didn't have a follow-up, but it was just that I think you addressed it, if somebody has ever mentioned that kind of privilege affecting your research. And I think it's also when it comes to gender, it's recognizing how gender, circulates, right? Not just for women, right? Gender is not just only women, but how you also, and we've talked about this before, how you recognize that creates a particular kind of setting and relationship. So I just wanted to ask you, if you want to add something, if people has ever confronted you about that, and in a way also our privilege, I think, is earned, right? In very different ways, but it's a way to honor our own family history, right? And the people, whether our working parents or working, in your case, it's a way to honor the work they did for us. And so I don't know, I guess it's more of a comment, and if you want to follow up with something short, and then we go into the next question.
Yeah, so thank you, Carolina. And yeah, I mostly worked with a single mother in the fields, right? And so I definitely understand, the importance of looking at, women farm workers and their experiences. To be quick, no one's ever confronted me about my gender, but it's still something that, of course, I pay attention to, because you have to sort of, as we say, you have to be able to be conscious of your presence. And so, but yeah, no, I've never been directly sort of confronted. Thanks for the question.
All right. So.
Yeah, so can you talk about, next question here, the structural forces that marginalize the communities that you work with?
Sure, and I think that's something that I started mentioning in the introduction to my research, but so I would say there's a couple of really important social forces. One has to do with the history in the present, and it has to do with the way ideas about race, class, gender, and ethnicity persist in today's Medellin and Antioquia. So because Medellin was a very important place in colonial times, and the history of Antioquia in itself is very much imbued by colonial history, there's a lot of hierarchies and discriminations based on gender, race, class, and ethnicity. And we see these in the movement, and we see it in the city, a city that is really two cities, a city that is very showy, a city that is very touristic, but also a city where there's been a lot, in the neighborhoods or in the comunas where women live. So I would call those race, class, and gender, we call it ideologies in, academic parlance, but ideas, as one of the biggest forces that keep, working class, racialized women in a position of marginalization. The other two forces are ideas about gender and sexuality that are very conservative. And again, this is linked to the fact that the Catholic Church has had a stronghold in Antioquia. And you see, when you think about the women of Medellin, when I think about the women of Medellin doing this activism, I'm impressed because they're really going against the grain of what stereotypically women should be, good mothers, good, beautiful women, right? And they're out there poniendo el cuerpo, as they say, really in a region where there's a lot of misogyny and a lot of violence. And I think they really try very hard going against those rules. And the last two things is, or I would say the one is definitely the violence of the armed conflict that is connected to poverty, is connected to control over the territories where they live, right? So there is a history of paramilitary groups, guerrilla groups, the army, as well as narco trafficking, right, that converge in these neighborhoods and create conditions that are very unsafe for everyone, but for women, a specific kind of lack of safety. So you combine all that, and it really is a lot to grapple with. But I would leave it there because yeah, I want to hear about you and what are these forces, and then maybe I can ask you a follow-up.
Thank you, Carolina. That was, sad answer, but very incredible to hear your insight. And I just want to follow up by saying that is a familiar story from other regions in Latin America that I'm more sort of used to or have read and studied more from El Salvador and, so parts of Central America and places that experience long periods of violence, and the way that sexism and misogyny interact with those forms of oftentimes state-sanctioned violence, right? And so it's very, very sad stuff, but very important things to discuss, certainly. For me, I would just say that the sort of big structural force that marginalizes farm workers in the US is racism, right? And so we don't oftentimes, talk about this, I think, more openly in our society. But, who are the original farm workers of the United States? When you ask yourselves that question, I think for most of us who understand US history, we think about slavery, yes? And so obviously the African slave trade, the mid-Atlantic slave trade into the United States is at the core, in my opinion, historically speaking, of farm worker injustice, right? When we end up getting into the 20th century and farm labor in the United States becomes a lot more Mexican in particular, then we see, again, racism in the form of anti-Mexican racism in the United States. Of course, these are countries that have these tensions. They went to war with each other in the 19th century, and there was a lot of land taken from what used to be Mexico, became the United States. And those tensions have, they carry over. And I would argue, of course, and many other people argue, that those tensions carry over today. And so certainly I would say that at the core of farm worker marginalization is this history of, both anti-Blackness and anti-Mexican sentiment that continue to oppress farm workers. In fact, farm workers today are excluded from federal labor protections that were born out of the 1930s and 40s reforms in the United States. Why? Because at the time, still many farm workers were Black in the South. And in order to negotiate these protections for farm workers, politicians needed to recruit the political class from the South to get them to vote for worker protections at the federal level. Many of those Southern politicians did not want to grant protections to their mostly Black farm workers and domestic workers, right? And so to this day, farm workers remain excluded from certain federal protections, even though most of them today are Latinx or Mexicanos, Mexicanas, right? They continue to be excluded because, again, that history of racism that found its way into policy. So yes, racism is the other. There's many other, but I think I would leave it there. Of course, the militarization of the border today, that and the fact that so many farm workers are deportable. Many others are coming over with guest visas from Mexico and other parts of Latin America that we see leaves them very vulnerable to marginalization.
Thank you for that, because I am the first to admit that a lot of this history was unfamiliar to me. And so I guess a basic question is, why do you think there isn't recognition of that anti-Mexican racism as much as it should be? Understanding that a lot of that also has to do with the fact that is the poor or working class Mexican migrants. Why do you think there isn't that much awareness of that? And you were mentioning before that there's been a lot of studies done in California, but not in Texas. And so, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people that don't know that. Why do you think that is?
That's a great question, Carolina. And I mean, I think I could write a whole book here just in that question. But part of the reason I think that is, Caro, if I'm being just honest here, is that in America, in the US, I should say, not America, but in the US, there is a proud history of the white farmer in this country, and that they have accomplished so much, and that they have, you know, fed the nation, and they were pioneers in, you know, establishing the United States. And in order to exalt or to lift the image of the white farmer, you have to erase the image of the Black, the Filipino, the Latinx, the Mexicano farm worker that is in fact doing all of the manual labor that is the most difficult portion of agricultural production. And so to me, you have to invisibilize these people in order to tell the story of how great white farmers are. And this is not to say white farmers are the devil or anything of this nature, but we're talking about the ways in which stories are told popularly. So thank you so much for that question, Caro, because I brought up that point without your question. I think it's a very important point.
Thank you, Jose. That's very insightful. I think we should move to the next question, if you agree with that.
Yeah.
So this question refers to resistance. So how do these marginalized communities resist in big and small ways? For example, how do they organize? What are the key strategies and practices?
Thank you, Caro. So for the farm workers, there's a couple of words that are very familiar to people who have been around farm worker struggles. And they are what? Boycott, yes? So if we don't have a lot of power as workers, let's try to get people who support our causes to try to boycott the products that we are producing. El boicoteo, no? And so boycotting, building popular community support, right, to get people to stop purchasing certain products. For example, today there is an active boycott against Wendy's, the fast food restaurant here in the United States. It's very popular, held by the coalition of Immokalee workers in Florida. They're fighting for improved conditions, and they're targeting the big purchasers of the tomatoes that they produce in that region of Florida. And so they boycott, and they drive people right they organize to try to get people to jump on board. The boycott has certainly been an effective method over the years for farm workers. Sometimes they organize strikes, historically speaking, marches, historically speaking, right? There has been, for example, in 1977, there was a 2,000-mile march from South Texas in the Rio Grande Valley to Washington, D.C., right? The Texas Farm Workers Union wanted to bring attention to the struggles of South Texas farm workers. And they had this gigantic march, right, to attempt to meet with President Jimmy Carter at the time. And so it comes and goes. Those are some of the big ways. I would say in small ways, things like what we see in the video, although I don't think it's that small, but, you know, confronting employers. And then other things, the way I see sort of resistance, Carolina, I don't know how you feel about this, but, you know, the being family oriented, right? So like, even as hard as farm worker life can be, so many farm workers I speak with, even myself, we say, pero at least we worked with our families, right? And the close bonds we build with our families as farm workers is oftentimes, to me, a form of resistance to struggle, right? The fact that we're going to be closer than ever because we went through this. And we play the system sometimes. Let's talk about the way we collect our unemployment checks sometimes, right? We go to work in the fields, we come back home, we collect unemployment from that state because we're no longer there. We pass time with our family together, not working for some stretches of time, if possible, right? And collecting unemployment. taking advantage of certain scholarships and other benefits that the federal government does have for farm workers. To me, when we participate like that, that's in a way resistance, suing, right? Farmers that are, or employers that are abusive. Those are also ways that farm workers resist. How about you?
Thank you for that. And I think there's some similarities, but first I want to address the comment that Gloria Sanchez is writing on the chat, because I think this helps me with the answer. So for mujeres populares, and it's true that the working class as obreras doesn't translate well in Spanish, mujeres populares are very much linked to what we call territorio. So it's very much place-based. So it really has that specificity of what we did in the barrio, in the neighborhood, or in the vereda, in the village, right? So that has a very specific way to determine how women decide to go out there to fight and to struggle for things like unemployment that you mentioned, to things like family, to political participation. And because of that, what you're gonna find among mujeres populares urbanas and mujeres populares rurales is different. They have to have different strategies. And some of it they do together, but in the everyday, the resistance is gonna look different and the organization is going to do different strategies. I didn't make it in the presentation, and I don't know if Bibi, but might be a little difficult, but there was a slide that I didn't get to show. It's called Organizing on the Ground. And one thing that the women from Red de Mujeres Populares have done is to, through popular education and through community organizing tools, to raise awareness about the right to water before. This one. Right, so, and they have done it in a very specific way. They have gone to neighborhoods where there wasn't access to water, and they have collected information, ethnographic information, to how does the lack of water, to clean water, affect women, families, the disabled, the elderly, and children. They did that, then they organized this multi-layer coalition with lawyers and with other activists to file a lawsuit against the city government and ask them to restore, or demand to restore, the access to water. And they won. And this was a combination of strategies. They did this in place, in the territorio organizing, bringing tools, like I said, like popular theater or cooking this big sancocho soup, right? Bringing musicians and telling the community, this is why the right to water matters, especially to women. And in the neighborhood, this matters, so let's do this together. So they do these things resisting at so many levels. So they do, demand the city via legal means, but they also do popular education and popular organizing. So they're very savvy in that. And if you go to the next one, and I'm sorry I skipped our script, but I really wanted to show you. If you go, Vivi, to the next slide, what I think is really interesting about this particular construction of Feminismo Popular is that then they bring this to the wide coalition of women's organizations. And for many years, they have created a document that is called the Citizens' Agenda of Women, in Medellin, and they use this in a large coalition to really push for things like water is, a fundamental right. And then they use this to lobby and demand politicians to be accountable, and also to tell them, what are you going to do if you're campaigning to become elected? What are you going to do for us? In the sense of, you're here because you're popularly elected. So that's why. And this is the way they organize in a very concrete way. So, yeah.
José and Carolina, so sorry to interrupt for a second. This is Alejandra. I wonder I know we still have a lot of questions that we haven't addressed, but we are at 11:17, and I wonder if we want to open it up for audience questions.
Absolutely, Alejandra. We only had 2 questions left, but I agree with the time. I know there are going to be questions, so I would love to interact with the audience questions and comments at this point.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I am seeing a hand by Juventina Herrera. So I don't know if they have a question, and I'll make sure that I see that I pay attention to other hands.
Okay, I don't know if you can hear me now. I think I had my, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so I had had left my hand raised when they asked about who was migrant farm worker, but now that I have the floor or the forum, I would like to congratulate Doctora Carolina for doing this work, man, and bringing it out to the rest of the world. I mean, as a woman myself and a migrant farm worker, yeah, the problems of water, clean water. This is one thing that we have in common, both the women in Medellin or Colombia and the farm workers, because that was one of the major things. So my question is, who is their leader? How did they get organized there in Medellin, or this woman? How did they get started? I mean, this is so, it's not an easy thing to do, you know, to get organized and to get started and to have people listen to you. So that's my question.
Thank you so much for this question. Definitely is I'm just amplifying their voices because the work, is their conceptualization, and is their struggle. I'm just documenting for us to know. So they did. The Red de Mujeres Populares specifically has a very interesting history that goes back to the early 90s. And there was an alliance between a feminist NGO, the name is Vamos Mujer, and a group, and my understanding of the stories I've heard, and this is a very simplified story, they reached out to what at the time was Comunidades Eclesiales de Base that were working in neighborhood churches and parishes. And they reached out to them because they wanted to work with domestic workers and other women from the neighborhoods to do, kind of an awareness, education on gender issues. There's a lot more to this history. As I mentioned, many of the women, like Gloria Sanchez, can you please zoom in, Vivi, in the middle picture? So Gloria is the woman on my left, and Marta Zapata is the third person on the left. They're both at the center of this organization, but I know that they have insisted this is a collective construction. So with the alliance between Vamos Mujer and this base group, they eventually formed this collective. Vamos Mujer sometimes channels resources to the organizations and work together. They help each other, creating campaigns and creating strategies. But because they have the experience of being organic community organizers, they already come with a lot of acumen. And the other part of that, in my study, what I see is that this organization is so big and it has so many layers. It's not just one group, but it's a group in conversation with many different actors that has propped them up and has allowed them to do things, sometimes with, like we say, con las uñas, right? They don't have necessarily always the resources, but they have the knowledge, the savviness politically. But so that's a very simplified answer. I'm sure that Gloria and Marta have a lot more in the terms of history, but those alliances really make them stronger. Thank you for the question.
And I think that Gloria has her hand up, Gloria Sánchez Betancourt. O Gloria Sánchez tiene su mano, so si puede hacer su pregunta.
Wonder if it's in the Spanish channel. I can't hear her. Gloria, no la escucho.
Quizás necesita que prender el micrófono, era mi problema.
Oh, okay.
Ok, si puede hacer su pregunta.
Maybe some technical problem. Gloria, o si quiere, no sé si Gloria me puede escuchar.
Que lo escriba.
Sí, Gloria, puedes escribirlo. Gracias, Gloria. Vamos a otra pregunta mientras tanto.
Sí, a ver si funciona también María Nava y a ver si la podemos,
So my
yes,
question is for Jose. So my father was also a farm worker, and we lived part of the time in California. So will you say in terms of the amendment of reformations, which state has made more for farm workers? Because I know California has become more active in protecting the rights of farm workers. Would you say the same thing for Texas?
Oh, no. California has a lot more protections for farm workers than Texas, Maria. So thank you for the question. It's a wonderful question because it makes us talk about things this way. It's one thing to have laws that can protect farm workers, and it's another thing that those laws are enforced. So while California has more protections for farm workers than Texas, it doesn't necessarily mean that those laws are respected or obeyed by farmers. And so this makes life difficult for all farm workers throughout the United States, regardless of the context. But in Texas, it's a little harder because we have less protections. And we also, with the giant border that Texas shares with Mexico, it has always made it so that you have this revolving door of workers that can just readily come through. There, when I interviewed Antonio Erendain, who was in that picture right from the Texas Farm Workers Union, he said that when he first arrived to California in the 1950s as an undocumented farm worker, yes, the man in the middle there in that picture, thank you, Viviana. He said that if you were very skinny and you looked like you were hungry, like people in California would say, es de Texas, eres tejano. The Tejanos were known to always be the sort of starving farm worker, the ones that had to deal with some of the worst conditions. But I don't like to compete. I would say that it's a mess everywhere. Florida, North Carolina, those are places that I've worked with farm workers too. And they're also really terrible conditions. But I know this, if they can organize in Florida, which they're doing, if they can organize in North Carolina, which they're doing, there's a union there, then there's nothing stopping us from organizing in Texas as well. Thank you for the question, Maria.
Thank you for answering it.
Jose, I think that Gloria's question is in the chat. That's it's for you, I think.
Okay, se reconoce el papel de las mujeres rurales en México en la defensa de la tierra, la soberanía y cómo se ve ese reconocimiento. So I'm not sure that I understand the question.
So is the role of rural women in Mexico recognized? Is the role particularly in the defense for the tierra and the sovereignty, like food sovereignty, and how does that recognition of that role looks like?
Yeah, so the reality here is, yes, there's a lot of movimiento in Mexico, particularly around, sustainable agriculture, and of course, even just worker rights for farm workers. There have been, for example, workers rising up in general Mexico. But the reality is, I don't want to answer that question because I am not an expert in Mexican farm labor in Mexico. My focus is the United States, and as it pertains to Mexicans and Latinos and others in the United States. So I would, when people ask me about Mexico, I generally refer to other people whose focus is more Mexico. Sorry that I couldn't engage too much with that question.
But what about here? Could you, like in your field work, maybe you can feel
yeah,
free.
so sorry, there is, for example, I think it's different because here in the United States, farm workers are not necessarily fighting for the land per se, because they don't own the lands. They don't, and those lands are owned obviously typically by large companies or white family farmers. What I will say in regards to women and farm worker movements, there is a very special thing emerging in Florida, in the sense that the Coalition of Immokalee Workers has begun to address gender violence, sexual harassment in the workplace for Florida farm workers. They've established a telephone line, for example, that women can call to be able to, report incidences of, gender violence or sexual harassment, that I think is very important towards empowering women farm workers. But to think about things like, defense of earth, or even just like sovereignty, is rather difficult in the United States, because there's nobody, again, like farm workers are not in possession of land in the United States the way farm workers can be in Latin America sometimes. Thank you.
Well, Carolina and José Guadalupe. I'm not gonna.
Gracias.
Yeah, en honor a tu mamá. Well, thank you so much. This has been an amazing discussion. I think that we kind of see a lot of very important connections between the struggles of working class people, farm workers in the United States, and the struggle of people in Colombia. And we have to remember how much together we are in those struggles. So this is a really nice connection that leads us to what we're talking about, how we get to racial justice. And we need to look at racial justice, not just in the United States, but globally, or at least within a Latin American context. So again, thank you very much. I also want to extend a special thanks to Sam and Hector for doing our work at translation, and to all the staff that worked really hard to get this together. Jasmine, Viviana, Justine, Allison, our interns, Elisa and Veronica, and all the staff at UTSA, Kirsten, Sonia, Jerry, and if I forget anybody, I apologize. I don't want anybody to feel that I forgot anybody. But and thanks everybody who participated. The questions were amazing. The discussion was incredible, and I'm really happy that this is one of many activities that we're going to have for the next 3 and more years that we're going to be working on this project. And I'm so happy that you're part of our team. And so again, mil gracias.
Thank you so much. Muchas gracias. It's been a pleasure talking with you, Jose, as usual. And thank you everyone for coming. And thank you, our team. All of you are amazing. Thank you. Thank you, Alejandra.
Thank you all so much. Our emails are in the chat as well. If you have any follow-up questions, I love to talk about farm workers and immigration. Send me all the questions on the comments that you have, please. Muchas gracias a todos. Amá, la adoro como siempre.